Hello everyone, I'm JG, and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm reviewing Mastodon's 4th studio album, Crack the Skye. Now before we get into this review, I just want to remind you that throughout this entire month of March, I'm reviewing all of Mastodon's albums, leading up to the release of their new album, Emperor of Sand, at the end of the month. So if you're a big Mastodon fan, make sure to subscribe to the channel so make sure you don't miss out on those upcoming reviews I have coming out. And if you want to see those old reviews that I've already done of their older albums, there's going to be a playlist at the end of the video that you can click the link to and then see all those videos if you're interested. And you should be, because Mastodon is a great band. Moving on to Crack the Skye then. It's my favorite Mastodon album, and throughout this review you'll probably be able to tell based on how much praise I'm going to throw at this album, but then again, how can I not, just given how good it is overall. Now, Crack the Skye continues on with the change that we began to see with Blood Mountain, where Mastodon were moving away from their sludge metal roots into a more progressive metal sound. Now, that's not to say that they didn't have any progressive metal elements in their earliest works. However, they were more starting to take over their sound in Blood Mountain, and here I think it's fully realized. I would say that this album is more progressive metal than it is sludge metal. However, those heavier elements do pop up at times, and when they do pop up, it is appropriate and integrated well into the whole progressive sound of this album. The vocals on this album are nowhere near as heavy as they were on older Mastodon projects. There are a few moments, as I said earlier, that are heavier, but for the most part, they're clean vocals. And speaking of vocals, there is something else I need to mention here, is the addition of drummer Brian Daylor to the vocal lineup for Mastodon. Previously, Troy Sanders and Brent Hines were the two vocalists for this band. However, they added Brian Daylor's vocals in on this album, I guess because they wanted him to sing. Now they have 3 vocalists instead of 2. That's just really cool in my opinion. Like most progressive metal, the song lengths here are on the longer end. There's 2 tracks that are longer than 10 minutes, which is definitely unusual for a Mastodon album, you could say. They did have a song, Hearts Alive, on their album Leviathan that was over 13 minutes long. However, that was really the only track on that album of songs that were mostly standard length. Now, this album only has 7 songs on it. However, the runtime is not much different than the Mastodon's previous albums, Blood Mountain, Leviathan, and Remission. You're getting the same amount of music, really, it's just less tracks that's broken up into. And now it's time for me to discuss the concept of this album, or the concepts. There's multiple concepts going on here that I need to discuss before we get into the tracks. And the first of those I want to discuss is the element theme going on here. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Mastodon, which as in my Blood Mountain review I said you should be familiar with Mastodon, all the first 4 of their albums were connected to classical elements. Leviathan was water, Remission was fire, and Blood Mountain was earth. And here, Crack the Skye is connected to the element of aether, which, if for those of you unaware, aether is kind of like space kind of stuff. Really kind of things that weren't able to be explained back in the older times, things like gravity, wormholes, all that kind of science fiction-y kind of stuff, I guess you could say, is connected to aether. And a lot of that is discussed within this album's story. Now, like Blood Mountain, this album has an original storyline going with it, and the story to this album, unlike Blood Mountain's, which is kind of, you know, as I said in that review, was kind of like, this song is kind of this part of the story, and it connects to this one, but there's not really a strong connection. You can kind of make it up as you go along. This album has a more complex, weird story to it, I guess you could say. Basically, what I read online concerning the plot of this album is that there's a paraplegic who can only move around with this sort of astral traveling, and while they're traveling too close to the sun, they're like umbilical cord that connects them to, I guess, whatever normal thing keeps them grounded, gets burnt off, and they're sent floating into space, and they get sucked into a wormhole into some spirit realm. And that's already weird as it is. But then he gets put into the body of some Russian guy who's like friends with the Tsar. If you're unfamiliar, the Tsar is like kind of a Russian king or a lord, I guess you could say. So he's kind of friends with the Tsar, and then he's gonna die. And then he gets killed, and his spirit and the spirit of the Russian guy that's his body was put into have to like kind of get him back into his old body. I really don't know all the details in like super depth, I guess you could say. I just kind of know the basic outline because listening to the lyrics, of course, it doesn't spell everything out for you. You kind of got to put it together yourself in a lot of aspects. But that was just what I read online, what the band members were saying the album was about in terms of the storyline. And it's a really weird concept that only Mastodon really could pull off, and they do manage to pull it off well. It doesn't really feel disjointed. They're somehow managed to mix up like wormholes and space travel with Russian czars and stuff, which I don't even know how you could do that. Like, if you told me to connect those things, I don't know what I'd do, but Mastodon seemed to do it effortlessly here. And there's more to the concept here. A lot of the story that's presented here, or at least in pieces, can relate to lots of things that are happening in the band members' personal lives. Particularly the death of Brondaler's younger sister, whose name was Skye, hence the title of the album, Crack The Skye. And when he was 15 and she was 14, she committed suicide, and that of course had a big impact on him. Of course, he kind of dedicates this album to her, and especially the track that's named after the album, which I'm going to talk about in more detail later on. And that, and as well as some other events that happened to the band members preceding this album, do impact the lyrical content and kind of the story that this album is trying to tell. You could take certain moments from the story I mentioned earlier, and they could kind of be compared to certain things that happened to the band members at the time period. Now I'm going to go into talking about the track listing on this project, and I am going to talk about every track in detail. I know I usually don't do that on my album reviews. However, given that this album only has 7 songs, and I do love this project, I feel it's appropriate for me to go into detail for all of them. If I had to describe the first track in a few words, I would say it's well-rounded and a great representation of what's to come. The track, really, I feel like all Mastodon's first songs on their albums are kind of like that, and Oblivion's really no exception. This track features all 3 lead vocalists on the track. It's the only track on the album that has that, despite all 3 of them being lead vocalists. The verse is sung by Brondaler, then the pre-chorus part sung by Troy Sanders, and then the chorus itself by Brent Hines. And overall, it's just phenomenal. I love how you can hear all 3 of their voices and the differences in them. It really kind of shows off how well-rounded they are as vocalists here on this album and just as a band overall. And of course, the guitar part, the guitar solo especially provided by Bill Kelleher is just phenomenal. It's one of my favorite Mastodon guitar solos, and it really captures a lot of emotion of the lyrics that are kind of describing, I mentioned earlier how he's out in space and he gets his umbilical cord thing burnt off, and this kind of what this song is describing. He kind of soars too close to the sun and he gets lost in oblivion, you know, space and stuff. He's kind of soaring through space, hence why the lyrics are kind of called what they are. And of course, it kind of has parallels to what I believe to be, I mentioned before, the suicide of Brondaler's sister Skye. I feel like the song could be possibly from her perspective, or it could be even written from his perspective based on some things I saw online. And overall, I just find that really interesting, the multiple interpretations you can get from the lyrics on this album. Oblivion, despite having lots of different vocalists, really sticks to the clean vocals. There's not really any aggressive moments on this track, which I really think also kind of demonstrates what you're going to be getting here on Crack The Skye. Lots of more progressive leaning moments, not so much heavier moments. However, when this album does want to get a bit aggressive with you, it's done so very tastefully, such as on the second track here, Divinations, which has these more aggressive leaning verses. They're not as aggressive as anything on Leviathan or Remission. However, compared to the rest of the album, I would say they're fairly aggressive. And then the chorus here just comes in with the clean vocals again and just shows off the really powerful vocals and, of course, the lyrical content. Now, the third track on this album, Quintessence, which is just another word for Aether, is a really cool track because the verses on the song are really catchy in my opinion, which is typically not a normal thing that you'd see with verses. Typically it's the chorus or the hook that's the catchy part of the song, and the verses are just kind of, you know, developing what the song's about a bit more in the lyrical department. However, the verses on this song do both. I think it's really catchy, yet it does develop the album's story and give you some really nice lyrics at the same time, making it definitely a high point on this album in my opinion. Now, track 4 on the album, The Czar, is one of the 2 tracks here that is over 10 minutes long, this one being the shorter of the 2, just a bit over 10 minutes in length. And it's one of those long tracks that split up into multiple parts with their own sections and name and kind of sound to them. However, it's connected just very nicely, making it one cohesive track. And now this track begins off with more, you know, more morose lyrics, I guess you could say. They're a bit sad leaning. However, a bit into the song, it picks up steam a bit with this really more aggressive sounding guitar riff and some more aggressive vocals that I think are catchy, yet at the same time really empowering. The song goes through a few phases, going back to that beginning part of the song again at the end with a bit more of the, you know, sad kind of lyrics. And I really like how they're able to compare the more aggressive sounding parts of this track with the sadder parts. And it has this mysterious vibe overall, and I really kind of like how they introduced the whole Russian sort of theme, and it just fits nicely with this whole, you know, space travel concept. And, you know, normally I don't think that would really work, but on this album it does. The next track, Ghost of Karelia, is, if I had to describe it as anything, it would be the soundtrack to what I would have if I was traveling through space. It just gives off that feeling of, traveling through space, looking out at the stars all around you, the planets, and all that kind of cool stuff. It's really science fiction sounding in parts, especially in the instrumental. It just gives off this really spacey, yet at the same time kind of aethery. I know that's not a word, but the whole element of aether just really is exemplified within the songs on this album. And kind of, as I mentioned before, things like wormholes and other science fiction space concepts, they really just fit in nicely with tracks like this. And now it's time to talk about the title track, Crack The Skye, which is one of the other tracks that features Brian Daylor on lead vocals. And given that this track is one of the ones that's most connected to, his sister's suicide and how that, of course, has affected him and the band, I feel like it's appropriate for him to be doing a lot of the vocals here. Yet, at the same time, vocals are also done by Scott Kelly of Neurosis, who, if you've been watching my Mastodon reviews, you know that he's collaborated on every Mastodon album since Leviathan in terms of the vocals. And here he provides some really aggressive vocals, probably the most aggressive vocals that you hear on this entire project. And, they're kind of juxtaposed with Daylor's more clean vocals. He really doesn't do any sort of aggressive vocals on this album or in any of Mastodon's albums, but he has this really sort of angelic sounding voice, and it's kind of compared with Kelly's more, demonic voice, and the way that they're put together is just really beautiful in my opinion. Lyrically speaking, while this song does have a place within the album's story, I really can't just help thinking about this track in terms of what it actually meant to the band themselves. It's just really a sad song, and it's not sad in like the traditional sense of, this kind of gloomy, sad acoustic guitar kind of song. It's very aggressive at times, as I said before, with Scott Kelly's vocals just being roaring at times. Yet at the same time, it really brings the emotion to the song. It has that anger, and it has that, you just hear him talking about how he doesn't want, the spirit of the person that's died, or whether that's be the character within this story of the album, or whether it be his sister Skye. And you just hear him talking about how he wants her to kind of be saved in a sense, how he doesn't want Lucifer to take her. It's just really powerful, and that's really not much else I could say about it other than it's powerful and just kind of moving. The instrumental on this track is also phenomenal. It really just kind of has that spacey feel again to it, and it just ties everything together really nicely. And then the album finishes off with its final track, The Last Baron, which is another one of the 10 minutes and longer songs, this one being over 13 minutes long. And this track, kind of unlike The Czar, the previous long song, which kind of was split into multiple parts, this track isn't. However, it does still move along with different sounding parts to it. They're not exactly different enough to have separate names or anything. However, they do keep the track interesting, which is really important when making long songs, that, you make them interesting. The vocals on this track kind of go back to some of the previous songs that have a more sad feel to them, yet at the same time a bit of an uplifting feel. I know that's a bit contradictory. However, the parts of the song where they're singing, "You can set the world ablaze" or something along those lines, those parts sound really uplifting, yet the rest of the song at times can sound really, depressing. And the fate of the person that's kind of described on this album, the one who kind of, had this crazy Russian space travel, I don't even know what to call it, happened to them. And their fate is kind of, determined on this track here. And it's just kind of a nice ending to the album. I feel the lyrics kind of, they feel really final in the sense that, this is the last track when you hear it. Just kind of based on the lyrical content. There's not much else to go from here. The instrumental on this track is also just beautiful all around. And it's just, very nice way to end this album in my opinion. Just a great closing track overall. And that's really it for the tracks on this album. However, there's a few other things that I'd just like to say overall for this album. The instrumentals, I know I mentioned this on a few of the tracks specifically, but overall they are very, spacey, sort of progressive, science fiction-y, and definitely different from Mastodon's previous albums. I mean, you can still tell it's Mastodon, however, it is definitely different sounding than their previous works. The guitars, drums, bass are all just excellent. The vocals, of course, I love how they used multiple vocalists. This really adds an extra texture to the vocal section on this album, or rather like an extra 3 or 4 depending on the track, if you know what I mean. Overall, I can't recommend this album enough. It's one of my favorites of all time, and in my opinion, with good reason. If you're new to Mastodon, this may be a good place to start out because it's one of their less heavy projects. However, it does have those progressive elements that may turn some people off. People that are used to listening to more straightforward music as opposed to 13-minute long compositions. However, look up some of the concepts behind this album and, kind of get into the mindset of what's going on here. The album story, what inspired some of the lyrics on this album, especially on tracks like Crack The Skye and Oblivion, and, kind of put yourself into the mindset of what the band was thinking here, and really you can kind of get lost in this album, almost like you yourself are out traveling in space, just getting lost in the oblivion that is Crack The Skye. It's just, this album kind of has a mood to it. And I know I've said that before in previous Mastodon reviews, I felt the same way about Blood Mountain and Leviathan, but this album just has a really spacey sort of feel overall that really gives it a personality of its own. If you're a heavy metal fan and you haven't listened to Crack The Skye or anything by Mastodon, you need to do so as soon as possible. And I believe that sums up my review for Crack The Skye. I don't want to ramble on for too long about this album, and believe me, I can. I probably could have made a 3-hour video talking about this, but, that no one wants to watch a 3-hour video of a guy rambling about an album. But thank you for watching anyway. If you enjoyed what you saw here, please subscribe, and of course, you're definitely going to want to subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on the future Mastodon reviews, as I mentioned earlier in this video. And of course, at the end of this video, like I said before, I'm going to have that link to the playlist with all the Mastodon reviews in it, as well as a link to the last video I did, which was Blood Mountain. So if you enjoy that album, you may just want to click that link and watch that review. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment if you have something you want to say. And yeah, stay golden.